and hands are limbered up, then Anders, then yeah, we're good to go.
Cool.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us. We're excited to be doing our first live wet demo in an actual studio with clay materials. And so this started out of a partnership with CSM, and sort of what sparked the idea of doing these dry and wet demos was this excellent book that Duncan and Tony over at CSM put out, Ceramics, the Indispensable Guide. And it's really incredible like how much information there is in there on so many different topics. And that goes for slip, like something that seems so basic. There's so many different ways of applying it, and so many different like methods to carry out with it. And I'm gonna do some live demonstrations of those techniques, and then Duncan and Gus are gonna sort of chime in and keep it conversational. But if you have any questions throughout, you can type those in the chat, and Gus will read those to us.
And I think for me, Anders, what was interesting when we were talking about doing these is the potential of slip. So in those early conversations we had and the things we were talking about online was actually, it's one of those basic techniques, or people can think of it as a very basic technique, but often the rush to get onto the next stage, to get it into the kiln, to start interacting with glazes, with underglazes, with those sorts of things. Often people forget about the potential of slip, I think. And it's one of those cheap materials. I mean, that's what we talked about. It's a cheap material. You can make your own out of any clay, basically. And then with any of the coloring ingredients, any of the oxides, any of the underglaze colors, then it's just an addition with that. So the book, by the way, we didn't call it the Indispensable Guide. That's nothing to do with us. That's Barron's and also Thames and Hudson.
Quite the compliment.
It's a compliment, yeah. But stay away from the Bible. It's like, some people call their books the Bible, and it's like, nah. But we are missionaries for clay in a way, for ceramics. Yeah. But it is, yeah. Slip for me has just been one of those kind of, through teaching over the last 30 years, it's just been overlooked so many times. And in the book, what we decided when we were chunking the pages up was that actually there was so much to talk about slip, you know. And so when we started having that conversation, it seemed an obvious one to start these dry demos with, because it's the first stage of thinking about decoration. And all that thing about, and I know we've laughed about it, there's nothing worse sometimes than if you've got a bisque firing coming out and it's just clay, that kind of often bisque that's quite a dry color, you know, you have to start thinking about it all over again. Whereas if you've got something with slip on, it's that undercoat, it's that something you can start having a conversation with. So for us, that was the funny thing, because we've all been confronted by a kiln full of bisque, thinking, okay, I've got to start again.
Yeah,
so
that can definitely be daunting. Yeah, and it's like, to sort of segue into that, like, I've got some tiles that are at different stages of wetness. So yeah, like slip can be the first moment of surface decoration, and that can happen at different stages. So I think one of like the worst stages, bisque is probably the worst. A pile of bisque is probably the worst, but a pile of like bone dry can also be pretty unsightly.
And Anders, it's interesting you say that, because everybody I talk to in ceramics, it is when the clay is dry, bone dry, it's almost as though it's lost its life.
Yeah, definitely.
It is that feeling that you think you can't do any more to it unless you start subtracting and things like that. So yeah, it's that dry material is something we no longer have that conversation with.
Yeah, definitely. And just to like back up for a second and talk about the slips and clays that I'm working with. So slip, like a really simple definition of slip is just liquid clay. And just like clay, there's many, many different kinds of slip. So I'm going to be mostly working with our red stoneware, and everything here is cone 6 oxidation. So this is our white slip, which most of that color is coming from, so there's graulig in there, and then there's also some ball clay, as well as like flux to keep it sticking to the body. But that whiteness is what's giving us white base. And then we've got just additions of different mason stains or oxides to achieve a black, a blue, and a green. And then same information, just with a clear over it. So aside from slip being like a really good first moment to put some life back into the work once it dries out, it can also be like an end in itself. You can do all of your decoration and put a clear over it and end up with something pretty satisfying.
And it's also, Anders, it's one of those things where we said, as far as the opportunity this provides, and also thinking about the book as well, because Barron's produced it over in the States. Over here it's Thames and Hudson. They had to have somebody translate, even though we think we speak the same language. We know we don't, because, you know, maybe we could touch on the things like vitreous slip and engobe, and I've heard it in the States, some people call it englobe. And so you know, just the terminology of slip changes between our two countries as well. But yeah. Also, is grow leg a China clay, or is that a ball clay?
China clay. A
China clay. So so there's different, and again, there's different forms of China clay.
Yeah.
But and also it's a thing where, for me, when I was a student, I wasn't that interested in glazes initially. So for me, it was a way of handling the clay with clay. I didn't feel as though I was covering the surface with glass, because I wasn't. But like you say, there's a bit of flux in there. So for us, it's quite often quartz or flint added to it. But yeah, it is that thing about it being clay. So it felt as though, yeah, you weren't covering the surface. You were actually enhancing the surface, the clay surface.
Yeah, definitely.
Great.
Yeah, so I'm going to do some brushing first. And just as far as the brush goes, you have a lot of options there too. If you're trying to cover a large surface, a nice soft, large bristles like this. You can also get sort of like a textural quality from just a cheap chip brush. And then when I go to the banding, we all use something smaller, of course. And just to talk a little bit about the consistency that things are going to be at. So for brushing, you're going to want your slip to be a little bit thicker, or it just results in needing more coats. But we'll see if this translates to Zoom. But this is my dipping consistency, so it's quite a bit thinner. So you can see it run off the finger there a little bit, versus the brushing consistency is just going to be thicker. So it's closer to like a pudding consistency there, where it's just going to require less coats that way. And you can get really specific about that. If it's just your own studio, like everybody has their own preferences. Here, we actually do take specific gravity for those, just to keep it relatively normalized. And I'm just gonna go for like an even coverage over these tiles. So I'm gonna use my larger brush, and it just depends on what you're going for. But the drying time is, of course, gonna take longer the wetter your clay is. So this first tile is a fresh one.
And I think, just to interject there, Anders, is that already what you've done is created a really interesting surface with those slight overlays of brush marks. So in a way, that could be it, where you've got that variation already on the surface.
Yeah,
before you add other coats. So I was going to show you this piece by Dan Wright, who, and Dan is a well-known British studio potter. And what Dan plays with often is the quality of the clay underneath. So you can see that's a little bit like your Brooklyn red clay.
Yeah.
And what you can see there, hopefully, is just that variation in thickness. And then what Dan will do each time is actually sgraffito his signature through that mark. But for me, that's just a lovely little finish where the bottom is just slightly indented. And then on the work on the side, you'll see that the blue slip is a lot thinner. So that thing talking about consistency, you've got 2 or 3 brush coats of the black slip there. The same with the white, which is probably dipped that in. But then this much finer blue coat here, which is just stippled on with a sponge. So again, just creating that variation.
Yeah. It just depends like what you're going for. I am really a fan of like those, being able to see some of the brush strokes and see the clay body underneath. If your goal is to like get full opacity, you can just apply closer to like 3 to 4 coats and hide the color that's underneath.
And with that, Anders, what's interesting is that people here are starting to use, or, you know, colored clays. So colored clays, a lot of different, obviously, techniques you can do with colored clays. But for a very cheap alternative to colored clay, just a colored slip, as you said, 3 or 4 coats on top of it, and essentially you're using that color clay. So that again is something to think about if you're thinking about not spending a lot of money on different colored clays.
Yeah. And so, yeah, this tile is like very fresh, as you can like see it bending. And even that has a different quality where it's starting to muddle the clay underneath, where if it's leather hard like this, I'm getting a clean application, but I still have that, I can see the color of the clay underneath. And then this one was on bone dry, so it's setting up pretty quick, but I'm pretty much fully opaque there.
So is that a leather hard consistency, that one? Anders?
This one was bone.
That was bone dry, okay.
Yeah, and then this one was leather, and that's just 1 coat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we talk about with bone dry clay is often you need more flux in the slip. So you'd need a higher content of either quartz or flint.
That's a really good point. Depending on like what slips you're working with, you might have a harder time. I didn't know from looking at a recipe. I don't know, but I just test it. If I've got a bone dry piece, I'll dip it and make sure that it is compatible there.
You're a braver man than me. Dipping a bone dry piece of work can cause tension, particularly if you've got joins.
That's when I just grab something off Gus's shelf, actually. Yeah.
That thing about vitreous slips is, what do you use the term vitreous slip or not?
We do. We tend to more often use the term engobe.
Yeah. Okay. So for us, we've just translated everything you've taught us as well. So we use engobe, vitreous. But for us, when something is a vitreous slip, we know that it usually has a higher flint content to make sure that the glaze application isn't going to pull the slip off the body because of that shrinkage rate.
And then just texture, the differences that you can get from just brushing over that too.
Yeah. So Anders, can I just go into the textured one slightly?
Yeah.
Is that what I've found over the years, again, I discovered this when I was at college, but to get this kind of surface on a pot or any surface on clay, before you brush the clay on, if you wipe the brush a lot so that you just have a residue of slip on the actual brush, that as you put that over, you're putting on a very, very fine layer. But if you brush it in one direction and then another direction and then another direction, you can start to, I don't know if you can see that, but build up the actual layers without hiding the quality of the clay underneath. So those bobbles are all caused by very light brushing in different directions where you're pulling the slip across the texture rather than it actually being too wet, so that it sinks into that texture. And so that's just one thing I'd like to kind of pick up. And as we go through this, maybe go back to that tile and try a thinner coat. Yeah,
cool. And then I wanted to do one piece that is like with really, really thick slip. And this is something that I've been sort of messing around with recently, is using slip to actually make like a stucco kind of texture.
Nice.
And so I made this slip out of our hand building body, which has a lot of grog in it. So it builds up this really nice texture.
Lovely. Yeah.
And it does get tricky, like to slip a tile that thickly and like minimize the warpage and everything else. Often slip, you want to dry really slow so that they can sort of sync up together. Otherwise you'll get it to start cracking off. But I've got just like a cheap chip brush, and I'm really just gonna like goop it on there.
What's that word? Goop.
Goop. Yeah, goop. That's a technical term.
Is that a technical? Okay, I haven't come across goop before, but that's now in my lexicon. Very good. And for those who were around in the 70s, you'll remember something called Artex.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. Where there are some very bad versions of this still in existence on people's ceilings and on their rooms.
Yeah.
I can tell you, as a child of the 70s and actually rubbing up against a wall with that on it, risk of severe cuts and bruises.
Yeah, I can remember like popcorn ceiling texture, jumping on a bed and just losing a little bit of my scalp.
But that's really interesting to see it used that thickly, and to have that kind of that form, almost like you say, it's almost like you're modeling with slip in that sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Anders, what sort of things have you had to do to keep it from shrinking too much and cracking off? Have you made any adjustments to what is in it, or?
I haven't adjusted the slip really, but what I've been doing is just using the slip made from the same clay body that I'm working with. So this one is this tile was made from the same clay body. And then
are you drying that quite slowly though?
Super slow. Like,
okay, good.
This tile, I bet like you could probably speed it up. I've just sort of started experimenting with it, but I bet I dried that for a week and a half, maybe 2 weeks. And the other thing that I did to keep those edges from drying too quick is I cut my border and then I applied my slip and then I put slabs back around it so that they're not getting hit with air. And then I also made like a little tent of plastic over it. And I kept it on drywall.
Yeah, I think that thing about, when you say you kept it on a drywall, you mean plasterboard?
Plasterboard.
Plasterboard, yeah, it's kind of not used that often over here, but it can be really good for keeping things. So the plasterboard is just very slowly, the plaster is absorbing some of that moisture from below.
Yeah.
Which often tends to, if you don't, it starts to curve, particularly if, like you say. But I would always err on, when students ask me about drying time, I just always say, you can never be too cautious. If you want this thing to kind of be okay without cracks, then the slower you dry, the better it'll be. I mean, something like here, pot's called Julian Stair, who makes really huge pots, as well as small ones, not as functional ones. He will dry things over 6 months just to make sure that this, I'm talking about something like, 3 meters high.
Yeah.
But he just says always, you can't, and he never gets a crack. Never gets a crack.
Yeah, I mean, if find a drying process that works for the work you're making and just stick to it.
Yeah.
So
in a way, we are creatures of habit like that.
Yeah.
If something works, don't mess with it.
Yeah.
But then, you know, in America, you're doing great work with kind of fast firing and things like that, where, you know, we have standard firing times for our bisque and glaze. Whereas, you know, there's been some insane work going on in like 2 hours, 3 hours of kind of fast firing work.
Yeah.
But you can do that if it's a particular thickness and it's all the same. But quite often in a kiln, you've got work which is very different thicknesses. So that's where the problems would come in. So, yeah.
And then, last brushing technique just on the banding wheel. And this is just an example of, so this has been bisque fired, but putting some slip on there allows me to just get a little bit of color on there and a little bit of decoration, so it's not just this daunting blank canvas. And you can hit the bottom, and then you can hit the top, you can hit the inside. There's just all sorts of options at this stage as well.
I think just again to emphasize the vitreous slip nature of that. So if there are any beginners listening, then, you know, slip should go on before the bone dry stage in greenware. So before it's lost any of its moisture, that's fine for standard slip. And when I say standard slip, you know, there's lots of different recipes, but a standard slip would be like you just said. Maybe it's just the clay that you've made the thing with. But if you've got a china clay and a ball clay without any other addition of quartz or flint or any flux, then that is not going to stick on bisqueware.
Yeah.
So it's that thing about it, you know, the differentiation, because some students get mixed up with that as well.
Yeah.
So just to be clear on that.
So this is, it's not quite bone dry. It's got a little bit of moisture to it still, but I'm using slip that is thinned down a little bit. And then I'm not going for like full opacity. So I might actually even dip into a small container of water too, just to get it a little bit more fluid.
Yeah, one of my favorite examples of someone that does slip is Matt Metz. Duncan, do you know his work? Or Anders, you know his work?
I don't know his work.
Mug at home, right?
Yeah.
How does he use it, Gus? Is it more of a coverall or is it quite decorative?
He uses it over most of the surface and then he goes back and draws through it. But the big thing that he does is he does these like really thin layers of it that are built up. So you have different opacities sort of stacked on top of one another.
Yeah.
You get these really nice like different shades. He's really often working with a dark clay body underneath and a lighter slip on top.
I mean, that was something when we were talking about slip the other week and about layers of slip. You can almost get a marble finish. You know, that semi-translucency where you see one color under another. So you can almost read the layers like a strata. And even though you're only dealing with quite a thinness of material, you can still get that beautiful quality of marbling if you're using just slightly different shades of slip. So again, measuring, you know, we talked the other week about measuring materials, and it's something we bang on to students about all the time, because if you want to repeat the same results, you need to know what you started off with in the first place. So that thing about measuring quantities of oxide, you know, there was a big thing here, obviously in the 70s, where it was just a teaspoon. You know, I'd read recipes, old recipes, a teaspoon, a tip of a teaspoon, a tablespoon of this, and then a pinch of this, and it was like a cooking recipe.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you want to try and repeat the same results, and trying to measure all your materials, and you can really build up beautiful shading with just, you know, 0.5%, half a gram of something, slightly darken it, but then that layering like marble. There's some work like that around. It's just fantastic.
So I'm watching.
Yeah. So just like different opacities, different mark making.
Oh, I like that drip. You didn't mean for that to happen, but I like that disturbance.
Yeah.
I like that intervention. Nice.
Yeah. Well, there's also a guy, when I think of just using slip as like a surface decoration technique, Daniel Ricardo Turan is doing low fire earthenware with white slip and just a clear glaze. But he's like got a whole, I saw one of his demos and he's got like, he's a total nerd with the amount of brushes that he has available.
Is he watching?
I don't think so. But he had a really nice technique with like a brush that was almost like just a cotton ball on the end.
Yeah.
And he would sort of just give it a dollop like that, and then also just blow on it.
Yeah.
And I kind of blew my design out, but
I like that.
Yeah, you get different opacities there. It can be really beautiful.
Again, another thing we said, and in the book, I end this kind of series of the brushing techniques with, if you don't like anything, you just wipe it off.
Yeah.
That is the beauty again. I mean, we know, you know, Maiolica, the appreciation of Maiolica, or however you say it in America, Majolica, Maiolica, Anglaise, you know, Anglaise tinware. The beauty of that is the appreciation that you can't make a mistake because you can't brush it off because you're brushing on top of a powdered surface with oxide. But the beauty for me of slip is that you can just, if you don't like anything of it, and this is why you should experiment with it, it's cheap, but you can just wipe it off and start again. So for me, that's the real beauty of it.
Looking for a rib.
I hope you haven't lost your rib. We don't want that. We don't want him flopping around, do we? If he's lost his rib.
Yeah, but
yeah,
like, if I decided that I didn't want this, I can just come with a rib.
Yeah.
And just erase it.
But again, the quality of that mark making, you know, we talked about mark making the other week and about the potential of mark making and how somebody like Dylan Bowen, who's a painter who's come to ceramics, starts his work from, say, if this is the plate over here, the action of coming across it and he ends over there somewhere, he captures one moment of that brush stroke, which again is a fantastic way. I was saying that he'll put 50 plates on the floor, stand above them. And when we spoke earlier, I said, "Oh, your wrists and hands kind of limbered up," because if you're going to use brush marks and things, it's like somebody doing yoga or going on stage to sing. You've got to warm up first. You know, we forget that our actions are governed by where we sit, how we sit, what height things are. So again, all these things, if you're thinking about gesture, as you've just done, like just the blowing on the plate, really interesting. No, but really
very
interesting.
Elegant.
Very elegant. But it is that thing about limbering up and getting ready to perform or ready to do. Because, you know, our wrists, I've seen people do awful bloody brushwork because they're sitting there just, you know, it's like plod, plod, plod. You've actually got to set yourself up. You know, people who work at the screen all day, apparently in the UK now, there's huge problems with people with backache because we're spending so much time during lockdown online and they haven't got their workstations set properly. And that whole thing about how you sit in that height you operate, I just say to students sometimes, just stand up.
Yeah.
Or put the work on the ground, you know. Yeah. So that being conscious about, you know, the marks you're making and how your body can really affect that in your sitting position.
Definitely. Yeah, and what you're saying about being able to erase and start again is also like knowing in the back of my head that I can start over if I need to. Yeah. I'm always looser with slip than I am with glaze.
Yeah, it's like suddenly all, you know, the pressure, the pressure of competition. It's like
okay, so I want to move into just a simple pouring and dipping, and I've got a bone dry pot from Gus's shelf. So who cares if the slip sticks?
Thanks, Gus.
Yeah.
No, but like Duncan's saying, so I know from experience that this particular slip is gonna do fine on this bone dry clay, but test before, or to be specific, use a vitreous slip.
And I've seen so many bowls at this stage become plates.
Yeah.
Where people have got a bowl and they go and they pour it out they wander off to do something else, they come back and they've got a plate.
Yeah, definitely.
So again, it's about consistency of clay at this stage.
Yeah, and keeping in mind, like one thing that's also noted in the book, which is so thorough, is
thank you.
Yeah, one might say indispensable, actually.
You might say.
Is keeping in mind, like, if you have attachments, they might be vulnerable when you go to like rehydrate it by dunking it in a bucket. So if you've got a handle on there, if it's a delicate, very small connection point, you might want to brush or spray so that you can control how wet it's actually getting. Or if you're gonna dunk, just do it closer to like a leather hard stage. Because when the clay is bone dry and you rehydrate it, it's really vulnerable to cracking or breaking at that point. Yeah, so I'm just gonna pour it in there, pour it out. It's a pretty quick motion, because again, if it sits in here too long, it's gonna weaken the clay, and I'll end up with a hole in the bottom.
So what you're saying there, Anders, is don't try and do 20 of these in one go.
Is what?
Is don't do 20 of these in one go, because you're playing catch up. So it's about the volume of how many you're doing as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, but it could be if you had a big line of them that you're trying to do, it'd be like that Claire Toomey piece where she's got all of her bone dry pieces splitting that are filled with water.
It's like, yeah, don't just pour them in and leave them. Yeah. In fact, Tony's just joined us, I think, and he reckons the book is definitive rather than indispensable. It's definitive, which I'd agree with. Yeah.
Yeah, I think some call it the Holy Bible of slip technique.
I think we must do. Yeah, it's becoming so, especially after this.
So when you go in for dunking, also like making sure that you've got something substantial to grab onto, because if it's bone dry, the slip should dry fairly quickly, but you want to just make sure you have something secure to hold on to. And sort of keeping in mind, how far do you want to go? Do you want finger marks? Do you want a clear line? I'm just going to do a quick clear line. Shake off any extra. And one dip is going to be fairly opaque when it dries, but you do get some nice breakage on those throwing lines, so there's still a little bit of opacity, which I like, or translucency, which I like.
And as you've gone through that thing about the consistency of slip, how you've got a brushing consistency, a dipping consistency, a pouring consistency. I mean, if you've just got one slip of a mix up, what I often say to students is that one dip, the equivalent of that would be three actual brush coatings. So again, that was emphasized when you showed the liquidity of the kind of the slip in the first place, showing off your finger how, the first one ran off and then the other one. So that thing about, again, knowing how to repeat results.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the consistency that like our dipping slip is at, there's really no reason for a second coat unless you're trying to hide everything that's underneath.
Which if it's poorly made, Gus, unlike your pot that is obviously beautifully made, you might well want to do that.
3 or 4 dips is usually what I go for.
All right, so I want to talk about spraying. I'm not going to demonstrate that because it won't really, the wind tunnel effect won't lend itself well to the Zoom platform, but
well, I'm glad you mentioned spraying, because I could show you one example. Great. So one of our colleagues at Central, our main technician, Andy Allen, produces or had a big show recently in college, and he takes his inspiration from the pipe work in the building. So it's very much a comment on post-industrial kind of decoration, if you like, which exposed pipes have now just become such a thing. I'm sure we'll be bored in another 5 years, we might be boarding them all off again. But at the moment, if you're in the hippiest joint in New York City, then you're going to see a lot of exposed pipework. And so our college is full of it. Our college is full of exposed pipework. And it's that thing about, you know, with Richard Rogers and the Pompidou Centre, turning a building inside out. You know, all the pipeworks are what people, I guess, who have cars, when they open the bonnet or hood. Do you call it a hood? Can't remember.
Yeah, we call it
the hood. Then you see this engine, or do you? I don't know. I don't drive, so I wouldn't know. Anyway, this Andy, what he uses, he's very conscious of the quality of the clay. So these lines, the movement, the way he'll use an extrusion and pull that off the extrusion rather than cutting it. The way he uses slabs, he's very conscious about the marks he makes. If you can see this one in the end here, you know, he's just kind of jointed that. So just a real beautiful kind of sense of the liveliness of clay, or the quality that clay. We often talk about edges with first year degree students. We're very conscious about stressing the idea that the edge of the clay is where the thing, you know, obviously it's this point between positive and negative, and how the eye suddenly goes to any edge that's wrong, you know, whether that kind of defines the form or not. But what Andy does, he sprays a coat on, and you'll see the darker color there. He's picked it up on the edges, and then he'll sand that down a bit, and then he'll spray another coat on. And this again is a vitreous slip. So this is going on at bisque wear. This isn't going on because what he can't afford to do is get cracks in between all these joins. Mm-hmm. So what he'll do is he'll mix up a vitreous slip, and then at bisque wear, and he'll low fire the bisque. So he's not going to take it up to 1,000. He's going to come lower than that. So it's still a bit soft. So the clay's soft. So we can take wet and dry. I don't know if you call it wet and dry there, sandpaper.
Yeah.
And soak. And do you call that wet and dry?
You just call it wet sanding.
Wet sanding, okay. So with this, it'll then start to uncover the slip, the layers underneath. So obviously, if you sprayed 3 or 4 different coats of colors on that, you could start to almost reveal this strata slip application. But for me, this still has, and this is a finished piece. This is then, once he's done the rubbing down, once he's sprayed, rubbing down, he'll then take this up to about 1180, so as not to distort those two things. But again, you can see the quality on that edge. As I said, he's very conscious about the edges. But for me, this is a lovely use of kind of slip, as using it as the final technique, but not hiding the clay quality of the object. And then just very quickly, I've got another one here. And it's almost like that's the color of the clay. It's not, that's the slip color. And again, being very conscious of kind of the potential for, you know, disturbing the surface of this.
Yeah.
Very fashionable kind of cracking and crazing and peeling. Has become,
so that one's like is that just like a dark stoneware or something?
Yeah. Well, that's the color of the slip on there that he sprayed a grayish color. And then this red color, if you can pick that up. So for me, again, just a really interesting way of using slip is to, like you just said, spraying. But again, being very conscious about the layering, the thickness of application.
Yeah. Yeah, I think whenever I talk about spraying with students, their first question is usually like, why? Or like, when would I do that? Because
that's a good question, though. That's what we want to encourage. Like, why are you doing that?
Yeah. And it just depends on what you're trying to achieve. Like we have talked about trying to disguise the clay that's underneath. Yeah. So when you spray slip, depending on how you do it, you can spray such an even, perfect coat that you can totally disguise the clay underneath. So that's like one reason that I've used it. It can work really well for plates that you can't dunk easily and you don't want brush strokes. It can work really well for large sculptures that you definitely can't dunk and you want sort of full coverage. And there's many other reasons that I'm not thinking of or don't often go to it for, but one reason that I go to it is for texture. And I mentioned the popcorn sealing spray.
Yeah.
So this is
Okay, yeah.
I don't know how well you can pick up the
Yeah, I
texture.
can see the flock, like a flocked surface, what we would call flocking. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so the way that was achieved was just by spraying a really thick slip, which I also added grog to. So it's got that sandy texture, and then spraying from maybe 3 feet back. And the other innovation that
Oh, nice.
Gus introduced to the studio was this textured spray gun. So it's exactly the same thing you would use in like a interior home to create that wall texture.
All right. I haven't seen one of those before. That's amazing.
Yeah, they're great. We have this like really cheap hardware store in the US called Harbor Freight. And I think this was probably like $20, but
no way. Bloody hell, that's amazing.
Yeah, and so it just like spits out texture in a way where it can handle grog passing through it. For any students that are listening, don't put grog in slip and spray it through like a regular gun. It'll damage it pretty quickly. But you could put really thick slip in here and pretty considerable like mesh size grog.
It was interesting where you said you stood 3 feet away, and what that often does, because when you are spraying, the further away you are, the spray becomes, suddenly the droplets become bigger by the time it hits the piece. So that's also something, about if you were demonstrating spraying, about the proximity of the object to actually where you're spraying from is super important. To get that thing where it allows the thing to actually hold on and take a grip of the surface, or if you're too close where it'll just run off, where you've saturated the surface too much.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you specified that. Yeah, it's like when I do that technique, I'm spraying it from far away and I'm watching so that the slip looks wet on the surface, and then I stop, because if I go too far, it'll run down like you're saying. But if it's totally drying out in the air before it meets the object, it's not going to stick, unless it has a considerable flux, which this does not.
Do you have Cornish stone over there? Do you call it Cornish stone?
We have Cornwall.
You have Cornwall.
Yeah, Cornwall stone.
Have Cornwall over here. So what's Cornwall then? So is that
It's got to be some sort of like shale clay.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the same as Cornish stone. I'll try and find the equivalent, because Cornish stone, I can't remember where the illustration is in the book, but if you just spray Cornish stone onto a bisqueware, it creates this bobbled surface. But you have to have the object on a tile that's a waste tile, because you can't touch the surface because it's so fragile. But actually, when it fires in the kiln, it's an extraordinary. It's a bit like the thing that Anders is showing us. I'm just going to see if I can find it in here.
Yeah, that'd be great.
There's a guy called Alex Huber, who's technician with me at another college, Morley College, 258. So on page 258, I don't know if you can see 258 in the book, Anders, 258. It might be the same page. Hopefully it is. Yeah. There's a, I don't know if you can see this thing here.
Oh yeah.
You see that?
Nice.
So a really interesting object where he's thrown this piece, sliced it, added a slab, but then the surface of it is just literally one ingredient. It's Cornish stone.
Wow.
Fired up to stoneware. But yeah, an extraordinary technique. But what does it say? You can't handle it at all.
Yeah.
So you have to have it on a tile. You have to do all the preparation of that before, and then literally just place it in the kiln as it is.
Yeah, that same with these. Like when I'm done with them, I pick them up like this and set them down. And then just to show what a finished one looks like, adding color to that with just like a colored slip over the top or even just an underglaze, you can get some really interesting effects with that.
And
texture.
again, with spraying, you can be very creative with the spraying because you can be very directional. So again, you can drift it across a surface, you know, that graduating color. So we're talking about using different stains, different consistencies of or different weights of ingredients. We
could do a whole series just on the spray booth. But I won't ask people to sit through that online. Okay, so let's do some rolling, which is not something that I do often, but this is a great one that was in the book. Great way to add a little bit of texture and a little bit of surface quality to it.
And again, it's just thinking about what I would do when I put the slip on the roller, is I would actually roll that on a dry surface before I then put it on the slip, or before I would then put it on the tile. So the idea would be to get, like you're doing now, really squeezing it into the surface, but test that onto the wood first of all, just to check that I've got the right sort of consistency. And then the first go would be then to put that on the tile then. So again, if you then let that dry and then brushed it in the other direction, let that dry, and then took a brush, rather than the roller, then took a brush over that surface, it would just pick up on the high points of the surface. So you really start to kind of emphasize that, you can just see when you tip it a bit, you really start to emphasize that surface. But again, it's like a painter would treat, how they would treat a canvas. They're so conscious about the quality of surface and their action when they come to apply whatever paint it is. And we know from painting that, as makers, we'll choose materials that we feel comfortable with. What makes an acrylic painter? What makes somebody who just deals with watercolor? Why do some people use oil? So it's all these things that give us back something so we can have a conversation with the material as we're developing the surface.
So sponging is also another great way to add a little bit of surface texture. And this is something that I don't utilize often, but it's really simple and effective. So I've just got a regular sponge that I'm going to dip into our black slip.
It's almost looked like you looked in the indispensable book.
What?
It's almost like you looked in the indispensable book or Tony's definitive book.
Yeah, definitely the definitive book. This was Duncan. Anders and I, our mom was a interior designer, and she went through this period where I swear she re-sponge painted the hallway like every couple months for like a year or two.
It was the mid-90s. It was the heyday of sponge.
I used to love a sponge surface. I made a lot of money when I first moved to London out of painting and decorating sponge surfaces. I can tell you, kept me going, kept my studio open.
And then another technique that's in the indispensable Holy Bible of ceramic processes is using a sponge to create pattern. So just cutting different shapes out, you can really quickly stamp a pattern. And similar to what, Duncan, what you were saying about the roller is just sort of testing it on something to get rid of a little bit of that excess.
Yeah. And again, this might not be your final design, but it's just something that you could respond to with the glazing or with further slip application.
Yeah.
So it might be, although that's not truly beautiful. I mean, it is, but it is.
I would say this is dispensable.
That's but it's something again that you could respond to. So I keep stressing, it may be just something that triggers some other action. Yeah. So that thing where you're always looking for this kind of to and fro, this kind of decisions on things.
Yeah.
It really, sorry, I'm just reading Tony's comment that it's on sale at all good bookstores or online at the moment. But wait until the bookstores open because they'll make money from it. So it is that thing about responding to a surface. And you can play games with your mates with noughts and crosses as well, which is even better.
Tic-tac-toe board.
Yeah, perfect.
No, I like the strategy of applying as many things as possible until you trip over something decent.
Yeah.
And then hone it in.
And then scrape it all off and start again.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because more is more. Basically what we say to this is not less is more. It's like more is more, definitely.
Yeah.
But again, it's just playing. You know, we say to students, please play well. You know, look at what you're doing. But don't be afraid to experiment. Anders, I don't know if you're just about to wrap up, but with the one with texture on, is that a bit more dry now?
The one with texture, the thick one?
No, the other one, the BKLYN Clay, the BKLYN Red.
Oh, yeah.
That one. So is that quite dry now?
Yeah.
So what
yeah, like I can't smear it.
Okay, so what would be good is to take that brush that's on that white on the surface.
Yeah.
And take a dip. Now brush that onto the table, and brush most of it off. So get a lot of the surface so that it's a very dry brush, if you see what I mean. And now go across the other way. So that way. So you can start to see the kind of a different kind of build-up of the slip surface. And what I would do is let that dry and then add another coat. And so you literally just start closing those marks in. What those deep gouges start to do, a bit like on here, is, again, they start to have a different kind of quality.
Yeah.
So those are thrown, you know, that's when I've thrown the piece of work. I don't know if you can see that, but as I've then started to pull the slip in this direction, it really starts to close that line up. So as somebody who's engraving a plate or etching or whatever, you're really conscious of that kind of quality of line. Really.
Nice.
I mean, that's the one thing to get across.
Patience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also it's those things about finding something you enjoy about it. I think that's
and it's not that much to think about. If you're in the studio, you just brush it on a few things, continue throwing or whatever you're doing, check up on it. It's similar to when I spray the texture on things. It might take 20 minutes between each coat, and it might take 4 to 8 coats, depending on how much texture I want. But you just fill in that time with other tasks.
Plenty of other tasks. As we know, we've said that the reason we're involved in ceramics is we like these different processes. Regardless of all the techniques, it's just the process of taking mud, making it into something, into form, and then firing it, and then responding to it again with glaze, and then firing it again. So it's all these different, I think for anybody who's involved in ceramics, if you analyze why you like it, it's because you treat the same object at different stages of the process. All reason why to give up and you don't like it. So it's that juggling. Great. So I think that ends that bit of slip. And whether we want to do more sessions on, we talked about resist techniques, and then also things like sgraffito. This was meant to be half an hour, folks, so I'm sorry we've only doubled the time, but there is so much to talk about.
Yeah. But we'll be doing another live wet demo, whether it's more slip or plaster sledging. So,
well, Tony's going to talk to you about that. So
cool.
See what we'll do with that.
Great.
So is that a good day, or is that a good night from me and a good day from you?
I suppose so. Yeah.
Okay.
It's time for lunch. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's time for my first gin and tonic now, so.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Duncan. Thanks, Anders.
Thanks so much, folks. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.